I would like to say a few words about Europe Must Act. Europe Must Act is a grassroots movement / organization which was founded on the Greek islands in 2020. Europe Must Act was founded by volunteers who worked in and around the refugee camps and back in 2020 in an escalating situation around the camps. And these people who founded Europe Must Act wanted to show that there are a lot of more people across Europe who are actually willing to support refugees. Today, Europe Must Act has city and national chapters across Europe and a central coordination team. And Europe Must Act advocates for humane migration policies and relocation of refugees and asylum seekers from the border regions to cities across Europe. Today's webinar is actually part of our Europe Must Act monthly meeting where we bring together all our members. And yeah, whenever we think a topic could be interesting for the wider public, for our partners, for our friends, for our followers, we are going to open up the meetings and try to support you in whatever you do. Then today, after this meeting, if you think that that was a nice experience, please get in touch with us because we're always looking for new volunteers in our central teams like social media and fundraising, for example, and of course our city chapters. And now I would like to hand over to Thomas for our presentation or your presentation about hope-based communication.
Thanks, Christian. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. It's great to see so many people showing up at the end of a long work day. And yeah, really grateful to Europe Must Act for arranging this. So yeah, I'll quickly take you through the idea of hope-based communication and also particularly focus on migration in Europe. And actually, I mean, when I make a general talk about hope-based communications, it usually focuses on that issue anyway, because it's my work on that issue that actually inspired the idea of hope-based communications. It grew and evolved almost by accident when I was just working in communications at Amnesty International. And my approach was based on, naming and shaming and raising awareness. And, as you all know, that approach was not working on this issue in Europe. And my family were refugees in Europe many years ago, and seeing what happened to them happening again was just, very painful and bewildering. And so I started trying to look at what do we need to change. And essentially what I found is the idea is that, well, first of all, fear-based communication is not working. So what is an alternative to that? But also the sense that we actually, this idea of thinking of narratives, and I'm going to try in this talk just to do a little bit about the sort of narratives that are causing us problems, the anti-migration narratives. What I really want to focus on, which is what hope-based comms is about, is how do we actually come up with our own narratives and push those forward. Quick note, when I say hope is about the idea that tomorrow can be better if we make it happen. So it's very much based on action. So very different to being positive or negative or optimistic or pessimistic about today. It's very much not that. I'm myself definitely not an optimist or positive person. Hope is very much action focused, is about our belief that we can make things better by taking action. And so basically the idea of hope-based comms is actually built around 5 simple shifts, where essentially I found that my own work was focused too much on the things on the left, and I was missing actually the change I want to bring about, which is what's on the right. So the idea is, and sometimes people think, oh, we only want the things on the right. No, the point is to balance our story, right? We need to talk about the problem, but we also need to show people the change we want to see. And there's some very important neuroscience underpinning this idea that I'm going to get to. And again, just the basic reason this is so important, I believe, is that actually this is about when we do the solution we want to see, the outcome, the things we want to see happening in the world. For life to get better, for example, for say people in detention centers or refugee camps, the only way that will happen is if we achieve our goals. And so, sometimes it's one of the challenges here is, there are so many bad things happening in the world. We have to shed light on them, but we also owe it to the people we're working for to actually bring about the changes that will actually make their life better. So that's what kind of is motivating this work. And just another key thing for starting this off is the idea here is there's loads of people who are, incredible experts in terms of doing audience research or message testing around narrative. And for me, what's important about this approach is I believe anyone can do narrative. You don't need to be a big organization like Amnesty International or sort of an expert in, say, like psychology or neuroscience. This is a simple approach because I think it's all of us have to apply these shifts to our own work and say, is there something missing from my story? Have I got to talk about the change I want to see? So usually I structure my talk around those 5 shifts. I'm going to do it a little bit shorter today so that we have time for a nice conversation. But what's really important here is the neuroscience that underpins this idea. And again, I'll try and keep it quite short while still putting in front of you some key ideas. So basically, trying to understand what's happening in people's brains when they vote for populist, for example, right? So what I had to do, and this is constant work that I have to do every day, we're not going to beat authoritarian populists by waiting for them to make a mistake. I think you could see Brazil, for example, right, where Bolsonaro is responsible for 700,000 Brazilians dying of COVID, and he still performs very strongly in the elections. So this approach is about not showing that the other side are wrong. It's about showing that our approach works best. And one of the primary reasons that populists are thriving is fear. And what we know from how the brain works is that when we feel fear, we have a certain response that we now know through brain scanning is primarily around something called the amygdala, which is in what I'm going to call, in a very simplified way, the downstairs brain. So that's what's firing up in our brain when we sense danger, and it releases stress, hormones and chemicals in our brain. Our heart rate increases, and crucially, when we're having that response, it's shutting down more sort of reflective, calm thinking, and crucially, it's shutting off the parts of the brain we need to feel the emotion that I consider the goal of my work as a human rights communicator, which is empathy. So, part of when I saw that, okay, facts on their own are not winning this debate for us, what is it I need my audience to feel for them to welcome others, people fleeing war and persecution? So this idea of an upstairs and downstairs brain is actually being bypassed kind of quickly by neuroscience, which is a really quickly moving field, but it's just a helpful way for us to understand some of these things that are happening. So this idea of a fear response, how we feel when we feel threatened or in crisis, is a different part of the brain is activating to that part of the brain that activates when we say, think of others, think of, try and see the world through the eyes of other people, or even think long-term, right? So long-term thinking. So for example, if you're thinking about someone trying to quit a bad habit like smoking, again, it's a big effort for the brain to mobilize that thinking of like, oh, I could get sick in the long term if I don't quit. Whereas, there's that short-term instinct to just feel good and light up the cigarette. That's another key thing to know about the brain now. How neuroscientists are increasingly talking is actually thinking of energy. Our brain is managing our energy reserves. And again, the act of thinking about someone else, of feeling empathy, is actually really draws a lot of energy from our brain, which is quite limited. So for example, in lab tests around neuroscience, they find if you get a group of people to do really complicated, say, math problems, once they finished doing those tests, they're less likely then to actually feel empathy for, say, someone like a refugee in a story they then read. So we need to start thinking of, our capacity. It's basically cognitive drain or cognitive exhaustion. We don't have that. We do have the natural ability to care about other people, but it's like a muscle, right? You have to build it up, you have to get stronger at it, and it can get worn out quite quickly. So that suggests, for example, that giving someone a 90-page report, we detail human rights violations, may tire out our audience quite quickly. Another key thing, I literally just heard an expert today on a podcast talking about how living in a sort of sense or a feeling of scarcity causes cognitive exhaustion. So this constant sense of crisis. So all of this neuroscience is I feel it really helps explain some challenges we face, like, compassion fatigue, right? That sense that putting out all these stories doesn't seem to be reaching people anymore. Part of this neuroscience helps explain why. And so what I think is, I'm going to simplify this in a very unscientific way. I believe that crisis makes people more right-wing. Let me put it a different way, right? If we feel like we live in a dangerous world and there's an economic crisis, there's limited resources, it's triggering self-interest rather than common interest, right? If you're in danger, you think about how to protect yourself or your loved ones rather than people who are different from you. And that's, again, something we know through this neuroscience testing is when we have this fight or flight response, when we trigger that downstairs brain, subjects in tests might be more likely to take action to protect their family, say, but they, again, have less support. They may even feel like more antipathy towards people who they identify as different from them. So again, this is starting to think about what is the mood or the emotion we need our audience to be in order for them to be ready to care about other people who, you know, are from a different identity. And one last thing that's really more recent on neuroscience is that our brains are prediction machines. What that means is our brains are constantly making predictions about what's going to happen in the world. This goes back to evolution, right? Where our brain is trying to sort of, you know, identify any potential danger we might face when we're cave people. What happens if I eat those berries, for example? But now it goes to this trend that we're all aware of confirmation bias, right? So our brains make decisions before we receive the information. And so our brains decide how to act, and then maybe we'll update those decisions based on this new information we're getting. So that's when you have, you know, you show people facts, but they reject the facts because it doesn't fit their way of thinking. And again, what's really important for us as activists, as people trying to bring about change, is that means our brains really don't like things that are unfamiliar, that are different. We're naturally suspicious of those things. And so people can't support something that they don't know about. And so this is a key message around narrative. To really sum up narrative work, it's about repetition. It's about constantly repeating our ideas. And that's why you see populists saying things like, take back control, make America great again, repeating those ideas over and over again. So I'm going to come back to that. But so just trying to lay a framework here, if on the basic principle of fear is putting people in the wrong mindset to be welcoming, what's happening with the story we're telling around refugees? So what is often inadvertently happening is we're creating this sense of crisis because we know we think there's a crisis and it's urgent people know about it. But if people see themselves as living in a crisis, it's actually putting them in the wrong frame of mind to support action. And often what we are doing is inadvertently using words or language or stories that make people feel that either what's happening is like a natural disaster, so it's just natural that it's like that, it's, you know, as opposed to, you know, it's the fault of government policy. So for example, when we think we're using neutral language, we might say, you know, something like the real cause of insecurity is the lack of properly managed migration. What we need are safe and legal routes to properly channel migration. So when we talk about channeling migration, we're drawing on metaphors of water because you channel water. And again, we're coming back to the idea of language, which we're hopefully not using anymore, like waves of refugees washing up on Europe's shore. And so what we need to be really conscious of is that predictive brain. When we use language like that, what are the ideas and images that we are conjuring up in the minds of the people we're talking to? And what's really important is that sometimes when we use fact and scientific language, we think it's neutral. It's actually, there is no such thing as neutral language. We are always triggering narratives in the mind of our audience. Because again, that predictive brain can only understand the world and the information it receives based on that person's own life experience, what they already know. So just putting the word refugee or migration next to the word crisis suggests it's a problem. Talking about migration as something that should be managed frames it as a problem. And talking about the scale of a crisis goes back to that wave idea, right? That it's again giving people the sense of being overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, whereas our predictive brain needs to actually see that there's a solution out there. So I'm kind of running through some of the problems here with the crisis approach on its own. So again, it's not that we never do these things, it's about what we need to balance with them. And so there's often, when we're faced with these crisis moments, we want to put out sort of, raise awareness around what is happening. And the problem is, again, these images go back to that wave idea. And they're also quite dehumanizing, of course. But the key thing for me is people who are anti-migration are also using these images. So sometimes you'll see, pro-migration groups using the same imagery that anti-migration groups are using for their own sort of, nefarious purposes. And so the question is, what are the kind of images and words and stories we need to put out there to make people actually support the things we're looking for? And for us to be careful, actually, of populists are very well aware of the sort of subconscious ideas and feelings they're trying to stir. And we can't avoid those subconscious ideas or biases that exist in the audience we speak to. We don't avoid them if we use what we consider neutral or factual language, because those biases are still there in the minds of our audience. So we have to be conscious of them and communicate to them in a way that maybe bypasses or even changes those biases. So, I mean, for example, I often say ordinary communications can raise awareness, but strategic communications changes awareness. So the basic principle here of trying to put the neuroscience together with the sort of strategy is that this idea of fear shrinks back, hope swells outward. And that's what we need our audience to do, to support, being open to people, to helping others, to welcoming refugees. We need that sense of feeling hope, which is, again, that sense of tomorrow being better. And it's also about agency, again, of our target audience. So it's thinking of the people whose ideas we need to change or shift, or that we need to mobilize to act. How do they feel? Because if they feel a lack of control over their own lives, then they're not going to be ready to actually think about the perspectives of other people, let alone take action to actually, welcome them and support welcoming them. So a lot of actually what's happening in Europe is and changing the situation is actually thinking about how our target audiences feel and think. And so a lot of the stories we need to start introducing, the challenge is, even when there's a story like you see on the left that actually says, migration is a good thing, right? And often we want to make rational arguments like, we need workforce in Europe and all things like that, or we may all have to move one day because of climate change. We end up triggering a lot of the underlying ideas or associations with this issue that actually are not helping us. So this is a story on the left talking about actually migration is a good thing, basically, but you're still seeing a dehumanizing, faceless image that makes you think of those flows, right? The sense of we're being flooded and overwhelmed. Whereas actually what we need to show more of is that it's actually happening. The picture on the right as an example of, actually what it means when it happens. So very quickly on the really basic points of framing, even if you decide you don't like hope-based communications, one thing I'm going to really ask you to stop doing is don't use any slogans with the word not in them. So remember I talked about thinking of the brain as a muscle that you need to strengthen. And I said that the upstairs, downstairs brain is a bit of a simplification. Really, the sort of more scientific way to think of our brain is as a network. Lots of neurons are all joined up, and they all different neurons for different functions. So like our fear response is a certain set of neurons learning to fire up and work together. The same goes for ideas. So when we talk about migration and crime in the same sentence, those neurons are firing together. And when neurons fire together, they wire together. So our brain is learning to associate the concepts of migration and crime, illegality and refugees, threat and refugees. So when we focus our communication on proving wrong the other side, first of all, we're letting them set the debate and not arguing for the things we care about, but we're also actually subconsciously reinforcing the ideas that they're putting out there. So here, for example, the imagery is actually quite empowering, but the message, the key word here is danger. We've actually got the word danger twice. And so quite depressing, but one piece of testing shows that people's amygdalas, those fear responses, are more likely to fire when the person you're testing sees a face of someone of a different race. That's only in one certain circumstance. There are loads of other ways we can manage that. But the point is, right here, you're showing the group of people you want our audience to care about and support. And we've got the word danger twice. And you can see how this is there, for example, feeding the message of the other side. And so that's why, for me, the first thing I want people to do with hope-based comms is, rather than saying we are in danger, when you're coming up with this graphic, you say, well, instead of saying not dangerous, what is the word we use instead? And that's a really basic example of starting to shift. And the basic point is to actually start saying what we're for. We want to bring these people here. And sometimes it feels, I know a lot of, even in my own work and groups I've worked with, it's like, oh, it's hard to say that, right? Because we think that idea is unpopular or we'll lose our credibility. But we have to find ways to make the case for the thing we want. And that's what hope-based comms is about. So a first step here is trying to shift from just talking about the problem to making the case for the solution. So this is an example from climate change. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez put forward this idea of a Green New Deal, and she created a video, I'm just showing you a screenshot from it, about what the world would look like if they actually passed the Green New Deal. So here's, again, a thing for our brain, right? Change is scary for our brain because it, again, involves things that we don't know about. We're already facing inflation, just come through COVID. People don't necessarily want to support the change we're talking about unless we can show them that actually, can we show them what it looks like for their lives? So essentially, how do we show people what society will look like if the policies we're calling for are put in place? So it's making the world we're trying to build seem familiar to people. And then what we also want to do is think about the underlying ways of thinking and understanding the issue we're talking about. So this is research from focused on the economy, but it's really relevant for migration and refugees. So they found that one of the barriers to sort of welfare state policies is that a lot of people think about the all of the things in our society: gender, the economy, migration. These are nations, borders. They're all constructs that that have been reinforced through our lives. It's a really important thing with the brain, by the way, is that we all have a brain set up in a certain way, but our minds are shaped by the culture we grow up in. And so in focus groups, these researchers found that most people think of the economy as like this bucket full of money. And if you take money out of the bucket and say, well, help refugees, for example, the idea of the audience is, oh, there's less money in the bucket for me. And this idea of a container metaphor, it's also kind of relevant for migration. Because a lot of people seem to, oh, we can't fit everyone. If we take a few, we'll have more people coming. Or shouldn't we help the people who are already poor here before helping those people? All of these ways of thinking are a barrier to support for our issue. And so we need to think of what is a different way of understanding how the world works, and how do we reinforce that through our communication. And this brings us to thinking about narratives, not just the narrative that we tell right now. So the narratives say that migrants are a threat or an economic drain, but underlying narratives are something we call meta-narratives, or you could also think of them as mindsets or a worldview. So basically a way of understanding how the world works. For example, do we feel that we live in a world of scarcity or abundance? So again, I talked about how scarcity, again, primes people to self-interest and to sort of a lack of that cognitive energy to think about other people. So the narratives reinforce meta-narratives, but they also are, affected by them. And then on the other hand, what makes a narrative grow? It's the stories we tell. So this is important for how we think about the really important message here, is that we all have the power to influence what narratives are dominant in society by the stories we tell. And so the stories that are most often, shared and read and talked about are the stories that, make a tree grow and make a narrative more important. So I'm only going to touch briefly on this, but when we start thinking about that worldview, it's basically so an expert on framing says the conservative worldview is built on fear, the progressive worldview is built on empathy, responsibility to each other, and hope. So the point here is, for example, we may be tempted to make the moral case for what we want based on what we think our audiences understand, worldview is. So we may be talking to, say, a sort of liberal, neoliberal politician, and we'll say, look, you care about the economy, right? Well, migration is good for the economy. So we think by drawing on their way of thinking, will it, achieve our short-term goal? But actually, most of the time, the rationalization that someone will say out loud is not the actual reason that they've made a decision. It's usually more emotional and instinctive, and that's a sort of post hoc justification. But also, the more we talk about what's good for the economy as the reason to do something, we're reinforcing that worldview. So the point of this is, it feels really hard, right, to say, well, we should welcome people because kindness is important, right? Because we'd sound like hippies. But actually, you have to use your own moral reasoning to make the case for what you want. It may be hard at first, but if you never do it, it never gets activated, and so it never actually will come to pass. So here's an example from some focus groups about some of those, what our worldview would look like empathy and community. So the underpinning idea here is the sense of an Overton window. I'm going to not go into too detail because of times. I actually want to focus on the action we can take. But the basic idea is you have to repeat your ideas to move them into the political mainstream. It's not actually just about the quality of the argument that you make or the evidence you bring. It's repetition. It's ideas being familiar, and that familiarity moves something into the political mainstream. So that offers an explanation of why these far-right parties are doing so well, because, for example, centrists try and take on their ideas to say, we're going to weaken the far right, but what they actually did was make far right ideas mainstream. And so what we can learn from that is the ideas we have that are on the far right that feel unthinkable and radical today, like a world where people can move, a Europe that's open to anyone. Those ideas will only remain unthinkable if we never say them. And it's through finding a strategy, and this is to me what narrative comms is all about. It's finding a strategy to, as Anat Shenker-Osorio says, make popular what needs to be said. So we don't just look at what we consider common sense today and only say what we think people want to hear. We have a strategy for taking ideas that might seem radical today and finding the ways to talk about them so that they start to become popular. And that's where I feel narrative change can be really empowering for people who feel that maybe our values are under attack right now. So it starts with actually just articulating really simple ideas and worldview, right? For me, for human rights, this means that actually it's less about rights and it's about the shared humanity. Because, a lot of us probably enjoy our rights right now, not because we're human beings, but because we're European or we belong to a certain nationality. And, Hannah Arendt wrote this about refugees in the 1930s. The world saw nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. So the point here is, when we work on narrative, we need to think of what are the simple underlying ways of thinking about the world that will actually, if more people shared them, or where they were top of mind in more people would actually be ready to support us. And so what we can then start doing is building up simple sets of phrases and ideas that we will maybe not just repeat these exact phrases, but those ideas. How can we all work together to make these ideas more salient in our society? So, and this is messaging that I've worked on around migration, actually. It also shows that we don't always have to do our campaigning and communications just by talking about the specific issue of migration. It shows us we can actually do some work via culture, for example, to make stronger certain ways of thinking that will actually come back and help us on migration. So that's something more complicated. Very briefly, one way we can start to develop these ways of thinking, which are quite unfamiliar to most of us, I can imagine, is A/B testing. So I did some work around what is a values-based message that will make people passionate about human rights, And very surprisingly, really simple messages around love performed best. And so actually it kind of makes sense a little bit. We see the other side using these tools to spread hate. Actually, you know, a hope-based shift would tell us that, well, the opposite of hate is love, actually. And so what this work also involves is building a new vocabulary that we can use to talk about the work we're doing, the change we want to see, and, you know, find a way to make that resonate with people. I'm going to skip the videos for time, but I'll send them around earlier. Just some examples of values-based messages. So I'm just going to skip a few things. So the key thing that I want us to talk about today is to start trying to identify what are the kinds of, first of all, if we have that ideas, these underlying ideas, right, that we want to get across, we can also, a really important thing for me is thinking about our values, not just in terms of words, but in terms of stories, because our brains are very visual. So what I would encourage you to think about is when you start articulating these values messages, is to ask yourself this question. What is the picture I want my audience to get in their minds when they hear the words I'm using? So I've done this exercise several times with migration activists and human rights activists all over the world. And it's also, I also asked them, you know, what's the picture that shows how society looks if you achieve your goals? And what often comes back is this image of newcomers and hosts together around a table. So this is basically, if we can start to articulate what our narrative looks like, not just the words, right, that we want to use, but actually the stories that bring our values to life, then we are empowered, even if we're just local activists, right, without a massive organization or an agency making beautiful videos for us. Our activism, our actions can bring our narrative to life. And this is something I often say to people is, I've written a report called Be the Narrative, because you have to be the narrative that you're trying to bring to life with your actions and with the stories you tell. So this is just one example, but it's just something that comes up a lot. It's again, so, you know, obviously we need to show people the suffering that results from not welcoming people, but our predictive brain also needs to see what it's like when we actually do welcome people. And so this is also just simple politics, right? I don't know about you, but I'm really sick of hearing politicians say, oh, Europeans don't want to welcome anyone who's different and things like that. We also need to make these kind of stories more commonly talked about, because I know that there are groups like, I'm sure some of you here are doing work like this, but it doesn't get talked about. And so we somehow accept the narrative that Europeans aren't ready to welcome others when we know it's happening. And so basically narrative communications, and we have to look at identifying those images, our vision, and then making them appear more and more. The more we put them in front of our audience, the more our brains become more familiar with them and then more likely to support it. And again, we can then also call on other allies to bring these ideas for life. So this is an advertisement. Again, I won't show it for time, but from just, I can't even remember, I think it's a food delivery company from the United States. But the point is, that ad is reinforcing, again, the imagery and the ideas that we need more salient in society. So it basically becomes easier for people to help push our narrative. And so the way I encourage people to think about narrative, it's like a mosaic. So, you know, like a mosaic or just your bathroom is made up of loads of different tiles. A narrative is made up of loads of different stories. And so that's where we can all, again, work together. We don't all need to use the exact same hashtag, but, you know, the idea in this was work in the UK around during the time of COVID was to say, instead of the us versus them messaging that was being used, is to try and create a sense of a larger us. And we can choose which stories we're going to share on social media today, what our activism will be. You know, are we going to protest something bad the government's done, or are we actually going to go and build our own alternative narrative, showing that society is different? So essentially, there's several examples of campaigners out there working on narrative who, for example, in the United States, they just created their own brands to push a progressive message. So they literally would set up a group, say, Greater Than Fear in Minnesota, and they would make their own videos to push this message, but they would also use that as a platform to elevate the voices of, say, a Muslim community that invited non-Muslims together for Eid, for example. But just starting to elevate those stories. And I think this is very a useful tool for anyone who wants to work on narrative changes, creating this kind of brand based on a value. And then this is an example of this mosaic work, right? Social media is really open to that constant stream of stories that reinforce a message. The example on the right-hand side here, you see a campaign called the India Love Project. So this was a response to, well, the ongoing sort of anti-Islamophobic racism being spread by far-right Hindu groups. But instead of, the more you bring to light, sunlight doesn't actually disinfect things, it makes things grow. So the danger with only talking about Hindu attacks on Muslims is that the narrative becomes one of Hindus versus Muslims. So they actually said, we're going to create a different narrative, which is showing how incredibly diverse and multicultural India is. It's just a stream of stories of weddings across different identities, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, all sorts of different groups, LGBT people. And so it's about, and to me, actually, again, this is a key thing. The darker times are, the more we need that hope. And the more it feels we're being overwhelmed by that opponent's message, the more important it is we keep alive, we preserve our values and our idea of how the world can be. So here's again an example of a campaign work that's being done in Germany, of trying again not to sort of create pity or sympathy for someone who needs our support, but rather a series of stories around encounters. Because actually, a really important point here I want to make is that we have to think of how we're going to change our audience's awareness. And the best way to change someone's mind is to show them someone like them changing their mind. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen the research where a lot of the greatest fear to migrants or others is actually communities that don't have that much migration, right? So we know that positive social contact, actually meeting someone who's different to you, creates more empathy for that group. We can't bring a nice person around and have them meet everyone. We don't want this good immigrant narrative. But what we can do is show our audience people like them having positive social contact. So the point is not to have either, on the one hand, good immigrant narrative or white savior narrative. The point is stories of encounter, of diversity, of people who are different meeting each other, having positive experiences. Very key. I want to just end with one or two strategic points. I know I'm going a little over time. So a lot of the time we talk about reaching persuadable audiences, but one thing that we often don't think about is how do we mobilize the people who most share our values to be louder in supporting us. So this is work I've done with UN Human Rights Group, where we wanted to find a simpler starting point for working with audiences is to think, we need more people to say, I want to welcome refugees, right? We want to make our narrative stronger in the wider debate. So the starting point for that is to take, say, hey, maybe people involved in Fridays for Future, people who care about LGBT issues, for example, but maybe they're not really motivated to talk about migration because it seems such a heavy political issue. Maybe, a low-hanging fruit for us is how do we get those people who share our values to be louder in spreading those values and reaching those persuadable audiences for us, and also the people who actually take part in these stories that we're trying to create, right? So thinking of our base, and then I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but there are a lot of very simple tactics then you can start to implement. If you decide your strategy is to take a certain idea and make it out, put it out there, basically. For example, we can think a lot more in our organizing. For example, there's a lot of stories happening right now that aren't being told. We can try and organize our movements to say, hey, we need you to tell your story more. And it's a very, very basic level. How do we start getting these stories out there? And then we can think about more sophisticated tools later. So, sorry, I'm just going through to make sure. Yeah, let me end there. Just as a simple way of thinking about narrative comm strategy, where I try and break it down to make it really easy for people to think about your message, what you say, your story being what you do, and the audience of who actually is taking part in that story to bring it to life. And around that, you can make a really simple strategy that you're actually trying to bring around narrative change. And I think that's something we can all do. So just sharing my details, and there's a if anyone's really interested in continuing to work on narrative, I really want trying to build community around all the people working on it. So there's a Slack group, which is for anyone working on narrative. I'll put the link in the chat in a moment. But of course, anyone wants to know any more on this can get in touch with me.